Alright, this is what I think is going to be a short video talking about the slave dungeons and the door of no return in Accra. Well, not in Accra, but in Ghana. Um, the door of no return is in any of these dungeons, castles, so-called, these slave pens, holding places that have physical structures. Um, but the ones I'll talk about are in Ghana. The first time I experienced slave dungeons, and we call them a dungeon. They say slave castle, but there's a brother in Cape Coast named Rabbi Kohen who has been there about 30 years. He's, among many things, he's the convener of Panafest, a biannual arts and cultural festival designed to bring blacks from the diaspora back to the continent. The first time I went to Ghana in 2003 just coincidentally happened during Panafest. And Rabbi Kohen explained to us as we were going through rituals and ceremonies that these places, we refer to them as dungeons and not castles, because there was no nobility, no decency, no honor here. It was misery, suffering, and death for our ancestors. So they were in reality a dungeon, not a castle. So the first time was in 2003 for me. And before I even entered either Cape Coast Dungeon or Elmina, I was in a car with two Ghanaians as we were going to a housing complex. I hadn't been in the country but 4 days. I had been in Accra for those 4 days, and when I went to Cape Coast, I was in a car, sitting in the front seat, guy in the back seat, and then the driver. And there's a road that connects Cape Coast and Elmina. As we were traveling around along this road that connects the two towns, they're only about 8 miles apart, I could see the dungeon Elmina off in the distance, and that's what this slave castle dungeon is called. It's named after the town. One's named after Elmina dungeon, the other one's Cape Coast dungeon. So I could actually see that dungeon off in the distance, and it was a mist. It juts right out to the Atlantic Ocean. It sits right at the foot of the Atlantic Ocean. It's about a 3-story tall cement concrete block building that's been in Elmina. It's the first European structure on the continent from my understanding, or at least south of the Sahara, but I think on the continent. The building began in 1482 and it's still standing, and I could see it. I knew what it was, and it's a mist that hung around it, like a fine mist, and I didn't expect the reaction. I hadn't been in it, hadn't been close to it, but seeing it off in the distance, I had a hard time maintaining my composure. It was very quiet. Nobody was speaking in the car. I didn't say anything. The driver, the passenger in the back didn't say anything. But I had a hard time keeping myself together. I almost broke down and cried. Didn't expect that kind of reaction, and this was just from a distance. So it took me another 3 days to get up the nerve and the confidence to go inside. It was actually doing Panafest, this biannual cultural and arts festival. So there were people in Cape Coast and Elmina from all over the world. Big contingent from America, the Caribbean, Jamaica, people from all over the place, and I was just one in many. So when I did go in, it was during Panafest, and I went in and I toured Cape Coast Castle Dungeon with a group of people, and we had a guide, and they walked us through the various holding cells and pens and cells on ground level and underneath, below ground level. They showed us a room that the men were kept in. They called it the strong man room, the ones who were rebellious, the ones who they couldn't tame or contain, or was being rebellious in one way or the other, and they thought they would be more of a problem than they were worth, so they put them in what they called the strong man room, and they closed the door. The room was maybe 5 feet by 5 feet. They put 10, 20, 30 of them in there at a time, closed the door, no air, no circulation, no light, no nothing, and let them suffocate to death. Couldn't shoot them in the head or hang them by a rope, put them in a room and leave them till they dead, till they suffocated, lack of air, which probably wouldn't take that long. So we walked around the whole entire place, the women's holding cells, the men's holding cells. We went to the upper level where the so-called governors and the Europeans and the sailors lived, operated from. And from the upper level, you can look over the wall and you can actually see the Atlantic Ocean and the waves lapping up against the structure down below at the base of the dungeon. And you can also see a fishing village, which is right at the base of the dungeon. and it's a kind of an eerie sight to see. And I won't go into my reactions because I don't want to predispose anybody to their own when they get a chance to see it. But it's an unsettling thing to see a fishing village right at the base of the castle. So I guess we were on there for about maybe an hour or two, but it was with a group of people. We entered the area. I think it may have been where the priests, they had an altar inside, and it wasn't there during slavery times, but it's something that has come about since then. And in this area, this room where they had an altar set up for traditional religious purposes, not Christianity, not Islam, local tradition. And they had wreaths laying at the altar like you'd have on a grave site. And the guide told us that the wreaths were there because a group of school children from the U.S. had come years before, and they were young children. And the experience of being in this slave dungeon upset them so much, a lot of them broke down and cried. And they just felt like they had to do something. So they went into the town, they went somewhere and they bought wreaths. And they came back and they laid the wreaths inside this room, holding cell, whatever it was, and they prayed. And that was their way of healing and dealing with this trauma, because it is a traumatic situation. So ever since then, the wreaths stay in there. But it started with school children from the U.S. laying wreaths inside this place and, you know, dealing with it like that. It's all, there's awe and wonder. You know, it's hard to describe the feeling. It affects different people on different levels. I've heard some break down and cry and have a fit. Some have been, I've heard, possessed when they go in. It's not a common thing, but it has happened. For me, it was both joyful and I'm trying to think of the word. It was a heaviness. The best way I can describe it, in Kansas City, Missouri, a decade or more ago, a young child was murdered. She was 3 years old, and her head was cut off. And it's the most horrific crime I've ever heard of, been around and seen. They had it on national news several times through the years, couldn't find out who the child was and what had happened to her. Finally, they solved the case. The mother's boyfriend did it, and she was right there when he did it, and they're both in prison for the rest of their lives now. But it was such a horrific, traumatizing thing for the whole community. And they had built a, it was right by a park where they found this little girl's body. They built a temporary shelter-like deal out of cloth, a memorial to Precious Doe is what we were calling her. Her name, come to find out, was Erica Green, but we called her Precious Doe. So they built a monument, not a monument, but a temporary memorial for her. And they had thousands of teddy bears and dolls and newspaper clippings. And it was such a difficult thing. I stumbled upon it one day accidentally. And it was such a difficult thing for me to be in that tent where the body of this little girl was found. And I got that same feeling in that slave dungeon in Ghana. Dread and all, but in the same time in Ghana there's a liberating part that goes with that experience. It's a joyful part. It's hard to describe the joy and the pain that comes from experiencing this slave dungeon, but it is. It's two parts. So in addition to that, the dungeon was built on what they call the holy rock. It's a ancient thing. Kind of reminds me of the black stone in Mecca, in Saudi Arabia. The stone was there before Islam was there. You know, it's the house of Abraham, and they revere to a degree the stone. So in Ghana, this place where the slave dungeon is built, it was built on what the locals considered the holy rock before it was built. And it's still holy because the blood of our ancestors flowed there for centuries. So it's a overwhelming and awesome feeling. I came back to Elmina about 6 weeks after I went to Cape Coast the first time. I went to Elmina. I was there with a friend from Ghana. Panifest was over, all the international guests had left the country, most of them had, and I was still there. So I went back to Elmina with a friend of mine, a local young guy, about 21, 22. His name was Emmanuel. We spent another 2 or 3 hours at Elmina, walking the grounds of the dungeon, touching the walls, and meditating, and do what we do. It's mostly done in silence. You're in your own world. So I was about to leave, and I saw an area across the courtyard I had not been in yet. So I walk over there, and they had 3 archways that you could enter in from, 3 different doorways. Excuse the noise. So I go in, and as soon as I walked in, I could smell a stench. And it was an old, musty, funky odor. You could smell it, it was obvious. A white couple came in through one of the other archway doorways after I was inside, and I saw them grab it, put the hand over their nose and leave immediately. Now, it wasn't that bad. It was obvious that you could smell it, but even had it been that bad for me, knowing what it was, I would have stayed anyway, and I kind of instinctively knew. And then I think I had in the back of my mind what I had read earlier about that stench. So when we left out, I stopped the guard at the desk asking what the odor was. He didn't understand the question. He thought I wanted to know where the female holding cell was. So as we were walking towards it, I stopped him again. I said, "No, brother, I know where the dungeon, where the cell is, but I want to know what that odor is." He stopped, he turned around, looked at me. He said, "Brother, that's the smell of menaces, of malaria, typhoid fever, vomit, feces, sickness, and death." He said, "Sometimes the living will be left among the dead for 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, flesh and bone rotting, and that stench is still there. In fact, when you go in the dungeons, they have excavated maybe 2 feet down. It was 2 feet over the centuries of blood and bone and human tissue that they've excavated, and they have a mark on the wall to show you the level of the depth of this misery. Yeah, you can actually see it." So it was just a shocking thing. Since then, I've toured a place called Anamoba. That's in a place, I think it's in Maury, outside of Cape Coast. It's a place called Fort Amsterdam. And it's not open to the public. When I toured it, you can walk around the perimeter outside overlooking the sea. It's up on a hill. It's a real kind of I don't want to say primitive kind of, that's not the word I'm looking for, but it's, kind of country town. Not a whole lot going on there, but this dungeon is still there. So I went around the outside a bit. Another one I've spent time at for events is in a place called Senyabreko, and I think it's Princess Town or something to that effect. It's another slave dungeon, and in this one, people rent it out for events, for weddings and funerals and social occasions, and you can also rent a room there and spend the night. And I don't think it costs that much, $15 to $20. I didn't do that, but I have been there for funerals and other things of that nature. And it's not far from Accra. It's closer into Accra, not far from Kaswa. So I want to end by saying the door of no return is actually a physical door that's a part of the dungeon. It wasn't a physical door maybe at the time of slavery, and if it was, it wasn't called the door of no return. That's something that has come along later to put things in perspective. So it's called the door of no return. You walk through this door, and the first time I did it was doing Panifest, the first time I was in Ghana. We went through the door as a group, and when we walked through the door, we were out on a ledge, kind of, earthen ledge overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. And everybody's quiet, nobody's talking, everybody's in their own world. The guard, not the guard, but the guide is out there with us. And after 5 or 10 minutes of contemplation, he says, "Okay, now we'll go back through the door of no return." And we made it into a lie, because they said we'd never come back, but we came back, and we're the living, breathing example, those of us who go back to Africa, of our ancestors' return, because we are our ancestors in a very real sense, in terms of traditional belief systems. So we make the door of no return into a lie, and it's like completing a journey. It's a process. It's an evolutionary cycle. It's lasting for maybe 400 years, but we've completed the process when we come back through that door of no return. And so the last thing I want to say is, for black people especially, it's good for anybody to go and witness history. You don't have to be a Jew to go to Israel and understand what the Holocaust was about, or the Germany and Buchenwald, whatever those sites are that they killed all those Jews. It's a humanity thing, But for us in particular, for me, it's like our Wailing Wall, and it's like our Mecca. It's a holy pilgrimage to go to Ghana, particularly, and visit these World UNESCO sites. And they have one that most people know about in Senegal called Gorée Island. But the ones in Ghana are even larger and even older and more ancient. So I say it's worth the price of the ticket just to go there. However much it costs to get to Ghana, it's worth the price of the ticket to go and to visit Elmina and Cape Coast, these dungeons. Experience that. Anything else you do in addition to that, which there is plenty more to do, it's just extra. It's a bonus. But it's worth the price of the ticket, $1,000 or whatever it costs, just to walk through these places. It's like a Jew going to Israel to the Wailing Wall and Muslims going to Hajj in Mecca. This is our holy site and our pilgrimage, in my opinion. This is a book I wrote, this is Cape Coast, Coming Home Through the Door of No Return. It's about that first voyage to Ghana in 2003, and I describe it in depth, manifest what that was about, what it felt and looked like and smelled like to go through those dungeons. This is another book I wrote called Rolling with the Hot Sauce. It's a fictional story of a black crime syndicate operating on the east side of Kansas City. And even though the books are diametrically opposed and altogether different, there's truth in both of them, and there's understanding, insight, and wisdom that you can get from anything. My oldest brother told me that, even, well, I won't go into the whole thing, but you can learn from anything. So I hope you get the books. They're at Amazon.com. Cape Coast, Coming Home Through the Door of No Return by Walter Ray. Rolling with the Hot Sauce at Amazon.com by Walter Ray. Check out the books. If you haven't been to Africa, think about going. You owe it to your ancestors. There's a joy that'll meet you when the plane touches down. There's a feeling that's undeniable of being at home and being connected. You don't have to be a black nationalist, a Black Panther, a Nation of Islam, or radical this or radical that. It affects people, and not just black people. Whites, they go there, fall in love with it as quickly as we do. There's something humane and intimate and wonderful and spiritual about being there. So go and enjoy, and thank you for listening. Peace out.